I know, I know.
Out.
Do you have, next week I want to teach the kids about Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Do you have any information on that? You can email me some links or something, maybe a video explaining, how he was important in Jewish history and stuff like that.
Sure. Remind me, message me later.
Oh, yeah, I'll text you. But yeah, but then try looking on the Chabad.org site, and I've only got like letters of Shema. I don't know if that's the same.
Okay, so welcome back from our hiatus. We're up to chapter 48 in Tanya, and I guess it's a good appropriate time, as you mentioned. Lag BaOmer is coming up in a little less than 2 weeks. Lag BaOmer is the yahrzeit of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, and he's the author of the Zohar. And this chapter is going to be one of the more Kabbalistic chapters that we're going to encounter in Tanya. We're going to learn some of the most fundamental and basic ideas that govern Hasidic philosophy and Kabbalistic teachings. So put on your Talmudic hat and get ready for some experiences. Okay. They tell the story that when Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Barditchev, he was one of the Alter Rebbe's colleagues, senior colleagues, when someone brought this Tanya to him to look over and to read, he reacted with amazement. How did he manage to put such a great God into such a small book? King Solomon said the same thing, right? He said, Hashamai, the heavens and the heavens of the heavens can't contain you. How is this house that I just built? But this is what God wanted. God wanted human beings to make a home for God's presence, but it didn't make sense. How is it possible for an infinite creator to be contained within a finite existence? And really, the Talmud speaks about dreams and how a person dreams about things that aren't necessarily reality. But the Talmud says that you can't dream about something that's impossible. In other words, you could dream about something that's fantastical, but not something that's impossible. And the example that the Talmud brings is you can't dream about an elephant in the hole of a needle, kupa damachta, which has two interpretations. One is in the eye of the needle, and one is in the point of the needle. Either way, even if it's the eye of the needle, it doesn't make it that much more possible. Why? And the Talmud explains, because either you have to make the elephant much smaller or the eye of the needle much bigger. And what this Talmudic principle is basically telling us is that there is a great distinction between big and small. And by definition, something big can't fit into something small. So how does God create a world, and how does this world exist, which is seemingly small compared to God, and yet God created it? Usually, if you create something, the thing you created is relative to you, relative to your intellectual ability to create such a thing, or your physical. Someone who doesn't have hands can't put together something with his hands. He can put something together with his mind, but it has to in some way relate. How does a finite world relate to the infinite? How is that even possible? So to introduce that, we're going to talk a little bit about the concept of tzimtzum, which we've mentioned before. I'm sure you've heard the word before. You know how we usually translate tzimtzum? Usually, I think that's why it's contraction, right? Where something that's big becomes smaller, right? However, the Arizal introduced a certain type of tzimtzum that we're going to discuss. But first, let's dig a little into what does it even mean, finite and infinite. If I were to ask you, define infinite, how would you define infinite?
Unending.
Unending. Is there anything in this world that you would define as infinite or as unending?
Okay, so you're talking to a computer programmer. And
No.
we're told from the get-go, beware of infinite loops.
No.
You could build a program that just keeps going and going and going and never stops.
Okay.
So
Never, never, or never because by the time it stops, you won't be here anymore.
you know, just the only way to stop it is to abort it, and the only way to abort it is to shut the computer down.
Oh, so it could stop.
If someone intervened, if no one intervened,
Well,
and it just kept
if people stopped powering the power plant,
right,
it would stop.
right.
So it's only going as long as people are making it go. So it's not truly infinite.
Well, infinite from the standpoint of the logic.
Got it. Okay, but it had a starting point.
Yes.
Okay. So even though it has no end, perhaps, theoretically, it does have a beginning, a starting
Yes.
point. So it's not truly infinite because there is a point where you could say before this point, it didn't exist.
Mhm.
Okay. What else? What else would you define as infinite?
It has no beginning or end.
So really, in this world, many people, when this conversation comes up, they'll say the grains of sand, the stars in the sky. When we use the term infinite in English, what we usually are expressing isn't necessarily true infinity, but it's a lack of ability to count, either because of time or space. But we all understand that the Earth covers a certain amount of space, and therefore there can't be more drops of water than that. There can't be more grains of sand. It may take you a number of lifetimes to count all of it, which is why you call it infinite, but it's not truly infinite. The same thing is with the stars in the sky. Today we know there are limits. We just don't know what those limits are. There may even be other solar systems, but within our solar system, there's a finite amount of stars, even if it's too many for us to count. But there's still a finite amount. True infinity is that there really is no end. Even atomic energy has an end. Again, we don't know what that end is. We may never reach the end, but there is an end, because if there's a beginning, there's an end. However, when it comes to God, and we say there's no end, there we mean from every angle there's no end. And theoretically, there's no beginning because God created time. So from the beginning of time, but time itself is a creation. So God is beyond time. So when we deal with space, there is no place that is devoid of God. God isn't in one place more than another place. The computer runs an infinite loop. After a while, the computer itself is going to start, just the hardware of the computer is going to start to erode, is going to start to I don't know, get hot. You have to put fans, but even after a while, after a few years, it's going to malfunction, right? It's going to finish its lifetime. From time also, God is found in time, not more or less the closer you get to the beginning or the end. It doesn't diminish or expand or get bigger. And the same thing is with even to categorize or to identify, just to think about it. There is no there's no end. There's no end. No matter how far you go, there isn't a time, place, or theory you can come up with that will make God finish, or this idea finish. That's true infinity. So the first thing Alter Rebbe is going to tell us in this chapter is that when we talk about God, this is the truly infinite, and it means literally infinite. There is no beginning and end. So let's see, page 728, chapter 48. Contemplating the greatness of the blessed Ein Sof, the thinking person will come to the realization that as his name indicates, so is he. In other words, as his name, Ein Sof, no end, indicates he is Ein Sof. There is no end or limit or finitude at all to the light and vitality that diffuse from his simple will. Simple in the sense that it has no cause, nor is it subject to the limitations inherent in mortal will. So simple not in shallow, but in simple as in straightforward, no complexity, so to speak. And this infinite, by the way, this description of infinity we're using not for God himself. That there's no description. We're using this for the light that shines from God, right? And this light that shines from God that's truly infinite, which is united with his essence and being in perfect unity. I think I mentioned this last time, the story of the Chassid who, a very big, knew a lot of Chassidus, and another Chassid wanted to remind him of his place. So he asked him, please describe to me Ein Sof. He's like, what? You can't describe it or explain it. Like, please, you know so much, just try. So he started to say maybe something. He's like, you already messed it up. Once you're going to start to describe it in some way, that's already not infinite, truly infinite, because you're putting a description to it. Once you're putting a description to it, you're excluding something that doesn't fit into that description. $7.28. So, okay, God, well, we're using the term God, but we're referring to the light of the Or Ein Sof, the light of God that's Ein Sof that has no end. That's what we're addressing. It's the only thing we, So that's infinite. What about our world? Is our world infinite? No. Everything a person does is limited, both in time and space. A person can't do something even in two places at the same time, let alone everywhere at the same time. And even if you will say everywhere, yeah, but that everywhere also has a limit. The same thing in time. Besides the fact that a human being lives for a certain amount of time, but a human being gets tired after a certain amount of time and has to go to sleep. Like, can you imagine a truly infinite world in which you never got tired? Well, first, you never died, never got sick, you never got tired, you never changed, nothing ever changed. You were in a constant state of doing whatever a human being does with zero limitations.
Like perpetual motion?
Perpetual motion in a way that, yeah, but even there, even if you'd say a person lost perpetual motion, it would only be within his sphere of influence. Now he's limited by space.
Right.
So maybe you'll take away the limitation of time, which even then he'd have to live forever and never get tired in order to categorize him as infinite in that area, but he'd still be limited in other places, in other ways.
Right. Well, I'm thinking like the astronaut who took a dreidel up in space and started the dreidel moving, and it was just constantly going. But even then, because there was no gravity and there's still some friction, but obviously very little. Eventually, that would even stop.
Yeah.
It may not fall down because there is no up or
No,
down.
the Rambam tells us that God did create things that these creations don't change over time, like the sun, the moon, the stars. So we are created and then we go away. The species never goes away, but we as individuals go away. But then there are individual creations God created that will last forever. However, they had a beginning, they're limited in space, and potentially they do have an end. It's just as long as God keeps them going, but it's not that they're intrinsically infinite, right? So there could be this possibility of, you'll say the theory of gravity is infinite. Yeah, but it's not. Because, okay, let's leave it alone. But think about even once the world is infinite, everything is infinite. So now you never get hungry, but you also never get satisfied. You have infinite wisdom, which means you never have to be taught anything. You know everything. It means there's infinite rain, but then there's infinite sun. Is physical things by definition have to, this is the definition. This is how you define something, by what they occupy and what they do, and not by what they don't do. That's the point of a definition. You're putting it into a corner to say this is what it is, and it's not something else. But think about, if we wanted to convince ourselves maybe there's something in the world that's infinite, what would be infinite? If something is infinite, nothing else would exist. Because if it's truly infinite, it would be occupying the space this phone is occupying. If the phone can occupy space that the infinite doesn't occupy, then it's not really infinite, because there's space the infinite doesn't occupy. So by mere definition, there can't be something infinite in this world. The world, by definition, is finite. Now, we can stretch the finitude. We could say, people used to live 1,000 years, now they live 100 years. Fine, but we're still 1,000 years. Even an infinity in numbers, there is a number. If you lived for 1,000 years, you could count there, or 1,000,000 years, or 1,000,000,000 years. It's just no one lives that long to make that calculation. But it does in theory exist, a number. So the fact of the matter is, our world is limited. And not only is our world limited, everything in the world is limited by space, by time, by weight, etc. Yeah, this room, it can only hold a certain amount of people. Now, the fire department may say can hold 50 people. We may be able to squeeze in 100 people, for a lecture. And if we fill up every last inch, maybe a few hundred people piled on top of each other, but at some point you're going to reach the limit. The point Alter Rebbe is going to make is that not just our physical world is limited, is finite, but even the spiritual worlds are finite. Because again, if the spiritual world is infinite, then how can you have two worlds? If an angel is infinite, how can you have two angels? Where does this angel begin and this angel end? That is not two, it's one. So any part of creation, not just physical creation, any part of creation of anything outside God has a limit, has an end.
I'm not talking about cloning, anything like that. Because then you have one person, but they're replicated.
But
It can be in two places.
But you're saying they're replicated. It's not one person. It's one DNA. It's not one person.
Right. Or entity, like you say.
But it's not one person.
Yeah. So
It's a new person with the same genes.
it's the same genes, but it's not the same person.
right. So you say,
And even one person, your right hand is not in the same space as your left hand. It's not occupying the same space. Your pinky isn't occupying the same space as your thumb. It can't. Your thumb will stop the pinky from occupying its space. And if it moves, like the kids say, are we there yet? Well, we can't be there, because if we're here, we're not there. Right? If we're there, we're here. We're not there. Yeah.
So you're saying even the spiritual world, you're saying God made all the angels individually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Tzilos. Tzilos has 10 attributes. If it has 10 and not 9 and not 11, each one. So spiritually, I can have all 10 attributes in the same physical space. I can understand it in my same physical brain. But they're different levels. They understand different things. They represent different things. They're different. They wouldn't be different. They'd be the same. Even two people. No two people are the same. No two. It says no. It goes so far to say as no two drops of rain are come from the same form.
Same about snowflakes also.
Right. Now, when someone read that in the Talmud 1,000 years ago, they thought, yeah, come on, that's an exaggeration. But now that we know with fingerprints and DNA that literally you can have trillions and trillions of factors that make up a drop of rain, it makes perfect sense. No two drops of rain are the same thing, are the same shape, yeah?
Yeah.
things that everyone used to think was hyperbole and just, fantastical, possible. So anything that we have a description for, or a definition, anything that has a name is by definition limited, is by definition finite. So any word you'll use for anything in the world or anything godly is a part of God that's part of creation. In other words, it's a part of God that he invested within creation that then becomes limited, finite. Even if it's spiritually finite, which means compared to us, it's infinite, but it is finite. So let's see. Page 729. Had the worlds descended from the light of the blessed Ein Sof without contractions, but according to a gradual descent from grade to grade by means of cause and effect, the loftier level being the direct cause for the manifestation of the level immediately following it, this world and all it contains would not have been created in its present form, which is what? In a finite and limited order. How do we know it's limited? The Talmud says, from the earth to the firmament, in other words, to the sky, is a distance of 500 years. 500 years journey being a finite dimension, even though you'll never live that long, but it's still a finite dimension. And similarly, limited is the distance between one firmament and the next. And the Talmud speaks about 7 firmaments. And so also the radical extent of each firmament is a distance of 500 years. And all the above applies to this world. That's this world as in the physical world. Yeah? That it takes 500 years to go from one, say, galaxy to the next. And each one is 500 years worth a distance. That's how thick it is, so to speak. And then 500 years from the next one to the next one, etc. But that's all in the physical reality. Even the world to come and the higher level of Gan Eden, the abode of the souls of the great tzaddikim, and the souls themselves, and needless to add the angels, which are all spiritual worlds, are all in the realm of bounds and limitations. Why? For there's a limit to their apprehension of the light of the blessed Ein Sof, which shines upon them through being clothed in Chabad, Chachma, Bina, Das, and so on. In other words, the fact that one angel gets more than another angel means that this angel is in this level, this angel is in a higher level. They don't occupy the same space. They're not infinite. Hence, there is also a limit to the enjoyment that they derive from the rays of the Shekhinah and to their pleasure in the light of God. For they are incapable of deriving enjoyment and delight of an infinite order without being nullified out of their existence and returning to their source. When you go to a football game, there's a difference between if you have I don't know what it's called, not a courtside seat, but a ground level seat, or a few levels up where you could see more, or at the top of the bleachers where you could barely see anything, even though you're all in the same game. No two people have the same vantage point. And therefore, no two people experience the game in the exact same way. And therefore, by definition, we are finite. If we were to be able to experience the infinity truly, we would become infinite. In other words, we would lose if I would understand God the way God understands God, I would stop being a human being. Because what makes me a human being is that I'm less spiritual than an angel. If I understand more than an angel now, I'm what am I? I'm just subsumed, I'm consumed within God. There's nothing that differentiates me from God. So here's the problem. The problem is we started with saying that God is truly infinite. But there's a problem with it. The problem with that is that if God created us, he created us in a way that we are finite and cannot truly descend from the infinite. Where is the crossover? Where did God make the crossover from creator to creation, where he went from infinite to finite? Where did that crossover happen? Remember, anything you create has to be in some way identical or some way connected to you. There is no connection between finite and infinite. So how did God, who's infinite, create a world that's finite in a way that it can't exist if the creator was there? Because imagine you created something that can't coexist with a human being. It's not possible. So how did this happen? But there was this crossover. And there's a story in the prophets where we see this crossover. We saw it in the temple also, right? In the temple, we saw this in a greater way where you had the Holy of Holies, you measured it, and it was 20 cubits by 20 cubits. Yeah. A cubit is about 1.5 feet. So let's say 30 feet by 30 feet. But then the ark was in the middle of the room, right? The ark was 2.5 cubits long. And it was the width of the house, right? So the length of the ark was to the width of the house. So if the room is 30 cubits, it is 30 feet. And the ark is 2.5 cubits, that's, let's say 4 feet, okay? 4 feet in the middle. How much space should be from the side of the ark to each wall, if it's right in the middle?
8 feet on either side? Well,
30. The room is 30 feet, the ark is 4 feet. The room is 30 feet, the ark is 4 feet.
okay, so then 26.
26. So if you measure from wall to wall, it measured 30. If you measured from end to end of the ark, it measured 4. What would you expect the measurement to be between wall and ark? 13.
13.
But when you'd measure it, you'd measure 15. And on the same thing on the other side, you'd measure 15 on each side of the ark and 30 the whole room together. This was the one place in the world, it says, where space and above space took up the same, were in the same presence. No one ever saw this besides the high priest once a year, right? But this is where there was a manifestation of the infinite in the finite. Where do we have this in the prophets, where this is something that human beings actually experienced? So there's the famous story of Elisha, where there was a widow that came crying to Elisha that she has 2 sons, and her husband died and left her with a lot of debt, and she has nothing, no way of paying them back or taking care of her family. And she's asking the prophet to save her. So the prophet says, who are you? Who is your husband that I should why should I, what are they called? Why should I bail you out of this problem? Why you? So she said her husband was Avadia. Avadia was a Jew who was in charge of, I think he was like the kitchen manager of King Achav's kitchen. King Achav was one of the most wicked wicked kings in Israel. He married a non-Jewish wife who introduced the idol Baal into the amongst the Jewish people, and she was exterminating all the prophets and all the sages. So this Ovadia took 100 prophets and hid them in a cave at his own expense. He took care of them for those few years. He risked his life and risked everything to save them and support them. And now he died. And now she's got all this debt to repay with nothing. So the prophet said, you must have something. What do you have? So she said, I have 1 jug of oil. So the prophet said, go and borrow as many empty vessels as you can from your neighbors, from your family. Fill up your house as full as you can with empty vessels. And then go and take the jug of oil and fill up all the vessels with oil. That's what she did. She went for however long, a few days, collected as many pots and pans and jugs as she could, filled up her house to the brim, then went with this jug of oil, and the jug of oil never stopped until every pot was full. And then it stopped. But why did it stop? Because there were no more jugs. It says there were no more jugs to put the oil into. But the oil itself could have continued if there were more jugs. The limitation came from the fact that there were no vessels to contain the infinite. But again, it was oil. It was a finite oil. It wasn't, the mixture. So this is sort of a manifestation of where we can see the marriage of the finite and the infinite. But the question is, how does that happen? We know that in the world, you can't have such a quantum leap. A quantum leap you can have, but a leap, an infinite leap, how can you have an infinite leap from infinite to finite? How do you get that leap? So this is the secret, not a secret. Well, it was a secret for many years, but this is when you speak about a foundational idea, a lot of them is called the secret. Sort of this is the thing that will answer all the questions. This is the secret. It's called the secret of the tzimtzum. And even in life, we encounter tzimtzum. Give you one or two examples of tzimtzum in where you encounter it either in a daily life, and at least one of them we've discussed in the past. When you want to plug your phone into charge, you don't plug it into the power plant. What would happen if you plug your phone into the power plant?
Right.
You wouldn't have a phone. Well, you may not even have yourself, but you wouldn't have a phone, right? What happens, so in order to do that, they put in like a converter or inverter or whatever it's called, transformer, that takes the electricity and contracts it, limits it in its form that it shouldn't be so powerful all at once. It should have a more limited form, okay? And then it goes on these long cables, miles and miles from the power plant. Let's say you went and plugged it into those cables, the phone would still burn up. Then it comes into the community and they divide that thick cable into smaller cables and it goes down the streets. What happens if you plug your phone into there? It's still, until it comes into the house. And in your house, it gets divided into, it gets put into the circuit breaker, and then it comes into an outlet in the wall, and you could plug your phone into there. Where does the electricity from the outlet come from? That power station. But if you plugged it into the power station, it would totally be destroyed. This is the concept of tzimtzum, of contracting. Yeah? I don't know how to phrase this question exactly, but would your knee-jerk reaction to seeing someone brilliant say, oh, wow, you'd be an amazing teacher? Not necessarily, right? The reaction of the person is, oh, wow, you're a genius. But no one's reaction, oh, wow, you'd be a good teacher. On the contrary, many times the smarter someone is, the harder it's for them to teach. Why? It's like plugging in a phone to the power plant. Now, a genius may be a horrible elementary school teacher or a horrible high school teacher, but he may be a great college teacher because he can lower himself, he can contract himself to the level of a 20-year-old, but not a 3-year-old. He'd go crazy in a preschool classroom. It's a different skill set. It's a different thing. But the point is that usually the smarter someone is, intuitively, the less likely they are to be a good teacher. You might want to learn from them, but you wouldn't want them to be the teacher in the classroom because then they're responsible for other things. In other words, if you're just looking for intellectual greatness, you're going to want to hire this guy to tutor you. But you're not going to want to be a teacher in a classroom because a teacher in a classroom needs to do things besides teach. He needs to, mentor and see what's going on. This guy could never do that. He's too smart for that. What was King Solomon's greatness? He was the smartest person to ever live. Why? Because he discovered gravity? He didn't. What made him the smartest person to ever live? So the Medrash says, or Kubit even says it in the verse, because he would bring 3,000 metaphors for everything. Now, I have to say, when I first learned that, I thought, okay, so he had a lot of time. But why does it make him so smart? If I spend time, if we spent the next few weeks sitting here talking about this idea, I'm sure we could come up with hundreds or even thousands of metaphors for this idea. But that's not what it means. It means 3,000 metaphors vertically, not horizontally. You have one idea, and he could bring it down 3,000 stages. Each metaphor being a metaphor for the previous metaphor, not different metaphors for the same idea. I explained something to my class, and they didn't get it. Sometimes it's because they didn't understand the metaphor. Sometimes it's because I'm a terrible teacher, and I don't know how to give a proper metaphor, right? So I could try to give a second. After I give 2 or 3 metaphors, I know it's not a problem with the metaphor. It's a problem in my ability to convey this idea to the child. So now I have to reframe it and say, wait, maybe I'm trying to give over too deep of an idea, or maybe I have to put this in other, I have to lower it down a level. King Solomon, every idea was able to bring it down 3,000 levels, 3,000 steps. That's genius, not in information genius, but genius in being able to teach, be able to convey something. But that means you understand it so well and so deep, and you understand the core of the idea that you don't get lost. Because a lot of times you bring a metaphor for something and really you're getting caught up inside things, and you don't convey the actual idea through the metaphor because you're excited about the metaphor you came up with that sounds like a good metaphor but doesn't properly convey the idea itself.
So coming up with an answer that doesn't really answer the question.
Correct. It answers the part of the question that you liked,
Right.
but not the questioner, right? A lot of times we say you have to answer the questioner, not the question. This is what Hashem had to do. Hashem, in order to create a finite world, again, not just our world, even the spiritual worlds, which are finite worlds, had to go through this process of tzimtzum, contracting himself, so that he should be able to be absorbed and seen and heard by creations, and they should remain creations. You have to go through tzimtzum. But because he's truly infinite and the creations are finite, it doesn't matter how many tzimtzums he would have had, you can't get from infinite to finite just by contracting. Because even a sliver of the infinite is infinite. There's no such thing, right? No matter how small you get the infinite, if it's infinite, it's infinite. So this has been the big problem. So that Arizal introduced a concept called the first tzimtzum, tzimtzum harishon, first tzimtzum, which totally removed God, so to speak. God decided he's not going to just contract himself, but he's going to make a space within his reality that he doesn't exist. And then he made a little hole and a kav, a thread of light that he allowed through the hole to fill the world with godliness. But this godliness is already within the space that God created that was once devoid of godliness. Now, this is the root of the big controversy between Hasidim and non-Hasidim and the Mitnagdim, the opponents of Hasidus, for the last 300 years. The opposition to the Baal Shem Tov was, the Arizal says that the Tzimtzum was in a way that God removed himself and then reinserted himself. But God reinserted himself with limitations. In a bathroom, God's not in the bathroom. God doesn't want to go into the bathroom. So when God comes back into this world, he stays outside the bathroom. That's why in a bathroom, you're not allowed to wear tefillin. You're not allowed to daven. In a place of idolatry, God's not in the place of idolatry because God's allowing this light back in. He controls where the light goes. The Baal Shem Tov said no. What the Arizal said about Tzimtzum is only from our perception, not in reality. God didn't make a place that was devoid of himself. What does that even mean? God's infinite. What does it mean, a place without God? It means that it seemed like God wasn't there. God covered himself up, so to speak, in a way that it seemed like he wasn't there, but he was. So it may seem like God's not in the bathroom, and that's why from our perspective, we can't approach God in the bathroom and pray, because from our perspective, he's not there. Does that mean that God actually isn't in the bathroom? How would the bathroom exist if God wasn't there? This caused the Vilna Gaon, the opponents of Hasidim, to the Baal Shem Tov to make an uproar. How could you say God's in the bathroom? How could you say God's in the house of idolatry, or God's in the presence of a person committing a sin? The Talmud says God can't dwell under the same roof with such a person. So what does it mean? So the Baal Shem Tov said that Tzimtzum that the Arizal introduced us isn't literal. It's only figurative. It's only from our perspective. Whereas others claim that Tzimtzum is literal. God literally removed himself, and for that moment in time, and in that space, literally God was lacking from that space. Baal Shem Tov said, God forbid, how could you say such a thing? Okay, so now you have to reconcile, how can you have idolatry within God's presence? Fine, that's a good question, something we have to grapple with. But at the end of the day, this is the idea that allows for a crossover from the infinite to the finite. Whether you take the approach that it's literally a tzimtzum, in other words, literally God not just contracted, but removed himself from the equation, or he made it seem like he removed himself from the equation, God created a space in which God's presence is not felt, and therefore finitude can exist there without losing its definition, its status, its finiteness, without resorting back to infinity. But what's the objective? What's the goal? The objective and the goal is for each one of us to realize that really this is all just an illusion. Really, God's presence is here the same way it was before the creation. And really, it's all infinity going around over here. The minute we realize that, the minute we start living our lives in accordance with that, the minute we start living our lives, that spreads around us, and the world is transformed into a place that's a dwelling place for God. A place that once opposed God, itself transformed itself into a home for God. It's the greatest accomplishment possible. This is sort of what's going to lead us to the course, the JLI course that's coming up. This is sort of the bedrock. Let's read a few lines, and then there's another metaphor that I believe I once shared. Again, it's hard for me to remember what was in Tanya class, what was in Parsha or JLI. So they say a good joke. How often can you repeat jokes and stories in the Torah? A good joke you can repeat once a year. A good story you can repeat twice a year. And a good Torah you can repeat twice in the same Torah, once in the beginning, once in the end. So, the middle of 731. Now, as for the intricate details of the contractions, how they achieve their effect, and what they actually are, this is not the place for their explanation. Yeah, we're not going to go deep here into this Kabbalistic idea of tzimtzum. But in general, they are something in the nature of an obscuring and concealment of the flow of light and vitality. You see here, he says concealment and obscuring, but not a removal. Yeah. So that the light and vitality should illuminate and reach the lower creatures in a revealed manner, pervading them and acting in them and animating them in such a way that they exist ex nihilo, in only an extremely minute measure, so that they be in a state of finitude and limitation. Yeah, in order for it to exist in a state of finitude and limitation, it has to remove itself. It has to conceal itself so that the infinity isn't overbearing. Because remember, by definition, once you have the presence of infinity, nothing else exists. Because if it's truly infinite, there is nothing else there. It just looks like there's something else there, but it's not really there. Because if something else really is there, then the infinite isn't really infinite, right? Remember the story of the prince who went crazy, thought he was a chicken or a rooster?
No.
You remember? So, in short, there was a prince once that went crazy, and he thought they convinced himself he was a chicken. So, his family, his father, the king, and the family sitting around the table, and he goes onto the table and starts eating from the floor the food, the crumbs that fall on the floor, and eventually he takes off his clothing because the chicken doesn't have clothing, and he spends his days under the table eating leftover crumbs from what the people are eating around the table. And his father doesn't know it. He brings all the biggest psychiatrists and psychologists and doctors. No one knows what to do with the guy. Finally, the king had a good friend. The friend said to the king, "Let me try something." The friend went and went under the table with the prince, took off his clothing, and started eating the crumbs with the prince. And told the prince asked him, "What are you doing here?" He's like, I'm a chicken." And after a few days, finally, the prince was convinced that this guy is on his level, is on his wavelength. After a few days, once the friend realized that the prince is in sync with him, one day he said, "You know what? Just because chickens never wear clothes doesn't mean we can't wear clothes. Let's try to wear clothes. Let's see what it looks like for chickens to wear clothes." So slowly he made a gesture. Somehow the king's servants sent some clothes onto the table, and they each started putting on piece by piece and talking about how chickens can now wear clothing until they were fully dressed. After a few days, he managed to get on all his clothing. Then he says, "You know what? Chickens have always eaten under the table because humans said, let's see if we could go out and make a space for chickens at the table." Slowly, the king's son ended up sitting at the table like every human being, and then his mind came back to him. Yeah. But how did it happen? How did it work? This friend had to lower himself to the level of the prince, that the prince would believe there's something here between us. There's no distance. We can relate. And only then was he able to lift him up. In order for us to be lifted out of this coarse physical world, God has to, so to speak, clothe himself, conceal himself, and lower to our level, to a finite level, in a way that we can interact with him, that he can convince us we do have some sort of relationship here, and then he could schlep us out. Yeah, I've met people before that resisted putting on tefillin for a long time, and then finally one day, for some reason, they gave in and put it on, and then things loosen up a bit. Why? Because originally a person thinks, "I'm not religious. I didn't grow up with it. I'm not capable of having a relationship with God." I mean, you're a rabbi. You're a religious person. I'm not. But once you sort of bring the two to the same level, where the person actually does the mitzvah and now is on the same wavelength of God, so to speak, obviously not, but the way God conceals himself and brings them into this world, now it's easier, it's an easier route. Because now, okay, maybe I do have some sort of relationship with this. Maybe I could have some sort of connection to this, even though till today I never experienced it. So this is the idea of the tzimtzum. Yeah?
Mhm.
The idea of the tzimtzum is for an infinite God to contract himself to the point where he totally conceals himself, a total concealment, and then a slow trickle, so to speak, revelation within the confines of our finite world. Every once in a while, we get a glimpse of the infinite, the splitting of the sea, the giving of the Torah, the temple. Every once in a while, there's like a flash of the infinite, but generally speaking, God is present in a finite way. We see God in a tree, the fact that a tree grows. So true, we understand it's an infinite God, but we see it in a finite way. The tree wasn't here a year ago. It's here now, and 30 years from now, it might dry up and die. But for now, we see God's presence within the world. So now, once we understand that God is infinite, we're finite, does it make a difference how finite we are? I'll illustrate this. The distance from 1 to 1,000,000 is a big distance. Is it closer than the distance from 1 to a billion?
Mhm.
Sure.
Yeah.
Is 1 to a billion closer than the distance of 1 to a trillion?
Yeah.
Yeah. What about infinity? Real infinity. Is a trillion any closer to infinity than 1 is? No. If it's real infinity, then just because a trillion is a trillion steps ahead, but it's still not closer to the infinite because the infinite is infinite. There is no end.
Mhm.
So in essence, our world is finite, is limited. God is infinite. And therefore, there seems to be no way that God should have a connection or a relationship with our world. We know how he made the crossover, but now how do you connect finite and infinite? They're unconnectable.
Mhm.
Let's see. This slide, it's page 732. By the way, we say that creation is ex nihilo. You know what ex nihilo means?
Mhm.
Something from nothing. From nothing, it's from God. So what do you mean from nothing? So actually it says that from God's perspective, it's called creation, nothing from something, because we're nothing. We're just an illusion, so to speak. God is the real something. But from our perspective, we're something from nothing. Nothing in the sense that we have no way of defining it. There's no label we could put to it. Any label we put to it is already a yes, is already something.
Mhm.
It's not nothing anymore. It's not the creator. But then how do we connect the two? This light and vitality that is revealed within them, in other words, within creation, after the contraction, constitutes an infinitesimal illumination and is truly considered as naught when compared with the quality of the limitless and infinite illumination. And there is no proportion or relationship between them. As the term proportion is understood in number values, where the number 1 stands in a certain ratio to the number 1,000,000, for it is 1,000,000th part of it. But as regards a thing which transcends finitude and numeration, there is no number, however great, that can be relative to it. Right?
Mhm.
For a billion and a trillion, when compared to infinity, do not even attain the relevancy of the value of 1 in comparison with a billion or a trillion. 1 is closer to a trillion than a trillion is to infinity. Because compared to infinity, 1 and a trillion is exactly the same.
Mhm.
For the sum of 1 retains some degree of relevance, even when compared to a trillion. It is, in fact, 1 trillionth of it. While even a sum as large as a trillion has no relevance at all when compared to the realm of infinite, but is veritably accounted as nothing. So we're going to have to figure out how to make the bridge between the infinite and the finite. Yeah, they say that the guy turned to God and said, God, you're infinite, so everything, millions of dollars is compared to $1. Just give me $1. So God said, sure, in a second. So what do we have? We have that it's not possible for the world to have been created directly from God without any process, without any unique process. Because if God were to create a world just in the regular process of the way things are created, that world would have been infinite and infinite and infinite and infinite. No matter how many iterations God would have created, no matter how many metaphors he would have made for the infinite, it would have still been infinite. In order for God to create a finite world, there had to be a tzimtzum. And not just tzimtzum, there could have been infinite tzimtzums. It wouldn't have brought infinite into the finite. There had to be the first tzimtzum, the tzimtzum in a way of removal, that it was, God was totally removed, again, only in illusion, but that God's presence was totally removed from a certain space, and then God allows his light to enter that space. the infinite light to enter that space. But it's now entering on the finite's terms, which means as long as the finite can't see infinite, this light of God isn't visible. So the angels see part of it. Moses saw part of it. He couldn't see the back of it. He could only see the back. He couldn't see the front, right? There's a limit to how much, because at the end of the day, as long as the human is a human, is a finite thing, there's a limit to the infinity they could see. You can't see real infinity.
What's the shorish of Tzimtzum? Did it have a shorish?
Well, some is fasting.
No.
Some is fasting, right? So maybe, what does fasting mean? Fasting means, well, contracting your body, but also contracting the intake, but limiting, and maybe that's,
Limiting?
I don't know, maybe.
Mhm. But Tzim and then Tzum, Tzadi Mem?
Yeah.
Tzadi Mem, with a Yud, Tzadi Yud Mem?
Tzadik Yud or Tzadik Vav Mem for Tzum. In
Okay.
different places, it's spelled different ways. It's
But
it's not a
shorish would be
biblical.
Tzadi Mem.
I would imagine. I don't think it's Tzadik Mem Tzadik. It's probably Tzadik Mem.
Okay.
Maybe just a double, maybe an emphasis like